Now, you had mentioned that an ancient civilization named Hyperborea existed near what's now called the North, well, what now is the North Pole, before there was a pole shift. Can you say what the modern names are of the land masses where it used to exist? I mean, was it on Greenland or what?
It was a widespread empire, and yes, part of it was Greenland, but it was also much. Mostly it was at the exact North Pole, what you consider today the magnetic North Pole. But part of it also reached inside of the planet, where it also later disappeared.
Uh,
Also, you're northern Canada to a large degree.
I know that time is malleable, but can you say roughly how long ago like the civilization first cropped up and when it died out?
Certainly millions of years ago. That's when it cropped up. We believe there was a last alteration at least 500,000 years ago. Approximately 500,000 years ago. Then again, it's 300,000 years ago was likely the final end of it. At least in terms of what you consider civilization. Many still went on to found other civilization, went inside of the planet or transitioned to Lemuria and later Atlantis. Some of them also are linked to some of the priesthoods that were found of civilizations, carrying on their knowledge. Some even infiltrated certain civilization, became a ruling caste.
Um, are the Nordic type people that Richard Byrd met at the North Pole in 1947 the descendants of Hyperborea?
He didn't technically meet them and North Pole, rather beyond the North Pole, so to speak, and they are descendants of Darius, that's very correct. However, there was also a larger civilization in the South Pole that are related to. There are also some things that are still in conflict today. Some groups from there, so I don't want to touch on sensitive subjects also for their sake, but also for your sake. But there are ideas that yes, when you went there, you met people that were indeed related to the civilization. However, he also met others inside their own planet that he didn't describe, so I'm also referencing now what is publicly known.
Right. Yeah, I understand. Um, Now, kind of a random question, but do you know if the mythology of Santa Claus and his elves living at the North Pole is somehow influenced by Hyperborea?
To some degree, but it mostly goes over much later cultures of the European continent that adapted their prior knowledge and incorporated in their mythology. It's not like the people that founded those ideas, which then later became part of Christianity through the Northern European pagan idea, were entirely familiar with what they were talking about. So over several angles, you could perhaps say such, but many civilizations on your planet have different mythological elements from people on the North or the South Pole.
Okay.
We've talked about how a pole shift put Hyperborea and Antarctica at their current locations. But can you tell me what caused this pole shift?
Just like the experimentation with certain technologies by certain people. It was also something like a stellar age when there was a new planetary body entering your solar system that affected the planets that were currently there. There's more to this. I might not have the full truth to the exact event, but I'm sharing what I can find in our own records, as this was quite a while ago. You
Okay.
still have the possibility of this happening again, though.
Do you know how long ago it occurred?
Not precisely, but it was likely before the current settlement of humans, the current culture, the current recordings that you're having of planetary events took place. It was likely during the Atlantean period. Yes.
Um, Yeah, I mean, obviously, the Atlantean period lasted for a long time. Would you say it was like more than half a million years ago?
Very likely, yes.
More than that?
However, there were also cultures before the Atlantean period,
Did it happen more than a million years ago?
from what I think, yes. But I'm
Okay,
not quite certain.
okay,
We were not there at the present time.
right. Do you have any information on like how it happened? I mean, did it just kind of happen within a few days, or did it take like many, many years for the pole shift to happen?
I believe it was a rather sudden event.
Okay. So did a lot of people die in the event?
Very likely.
Um,
There were not as many people on the planet, however, at the time as there are now.
right. Was there ever an actual landmass at what today is the North Pole, which later sank, or was the Hyperborean civilization just scattered across different land masses that exist today that you mentioned previously?
Those land masses were more merged into one continent, but there was also a mass at the exact northern pole.
So are there like like structures that exist underwater at our North Pole?
Very likely there are still some left, yes.
Okay. Um, can you tell me what Antarctica looked like before the pole shift? For example, was it entirely covered in plant life, or were there any desert regions?
It was mostly plant life, yes, but inland, so closer to the pole, it was some deserted regions, but largely it was populated. There was definitely flora.
Okay.
There was a lot of hot lakes that still exist today.
Can you tell me about the general histories of the two civilizations that used to exist in Antarctica and Hyperborea?
Hmm. Well, you're familiar with the idea of a pole shift, correct?
Right.
So originally there was much different climate. There are still some parts in Antarctica that are warmer than you would might imagine, where you could run around with a t-shirt, so to speak, or even perhaps naked in some areas that are quite tropic due to underground wells. And obviously, your region of Hyperborea was yes in the uttermost north, suggests. It also been referred to as Sule by many other cultures and societies. Ultima Thule, for example, like certain ones in the that came or hailed from the Hellenic people. However, this was there before there was Atlantis, much earlier. Also, the Antarctic continent used to be ice-free to its other location, hence your map by one of your Turkish researchers, travelers, true. However, the cultures there also later infiltrated Atlantis and also some of the other continents, which then again infiltrated other cultures that did not get destroyed during the floods, but it trickled down, so to speak, and knowledge was lost. However, in Hyperborea, there was quite a frequent interaction between people from other worlds and people from Earth. It was much more normal for people to interact with the gods, so to speak. And there was also more frequent cohabitation in one city between the gods and the humans, so to speak, which was already not as common anymore in Atlantis and Lemuria. Also, sexual relations at the time were not strictly forbidden, and therefore that also occurred in many of your later stories of gods and half-gods date back to those times as well as Atlantis. Even many of the Romans and Greeks claim that that was much, much later in their history. Many of their memories date back to their culture. Many of them simply overtook the original teaching and placed them in their own confinement of what you would perhaps consider cultural appropriation today in some of your modern understandings or readings of your own culture right now. A lot of information has been passed down that matter. Your Nephilim, for example, a story from your Bible, is also something that was more something common in those cultures, and not necessarily in the Middle East many thousands of years later. It also existed prior to Atlantis. Atlantis had a certain period. It was the ending time, about 30,000 of years ago. At that time, Hyperborea had already become uninhabitable due to a shifting.
Okay. I might have misheard you. What did you say happened 30,000 years ago?
That's when the Atlantean culture was founded or established as what it was then as a main center. Before that, it was also just a colony, similar to how Europe, for example, or North Americas became a colony of Atlantis later on, or ancient Egypt was famously.
Okay.
So before that, the center of culture, so to speak, was in Hyperborea. It was not the same name that was always used by the same people that lived there, but that's the culture from what I'm aware of that you're referring to. And again, mainly it was then the most common place that established that culture was the frequent interaction between a certain extraterrestrial race and the people that were created there.
Okay. So were Hyperborea and ancient Antarctica both under the same rulership, so to speak, or were they sort of separate countries with different leaders?
It was like countries, but yes, there were different groups of extraterrestrials that were interacting with both of those civilizations. There were also different junctures of time. Antarctica, from what I believe, came later. It was established later, about some refugees, but many also went underground. That's how you got your inner world civilizations and your mythology of Shambhala or Agatha and those other words from your different cultures that have those understanding of your modern Jules Verne, for example.
Okay. Were they democratic or more imperial?
There's something like a hierarchical structure. It's not just those two concepts exist. There are many different ways to govern, and something, for example, that has been existing in place for a long time is some form of hierarchy. So it would not be democracy from what you believe today as such, but it's also much different from what the Greeks, for example, believed that to be. But it was also not necessarily under control of the reptile, if that's what you're suggesting. They had their own understanding.
Okay. Were there ever any wars between Hyperborea and Antarctica, or any civil wars between those groups themselves?
Oh, yes. It was many times rebellions and misunderstandings of how to rule and run the whole planet, so to speak. And of course, there was a rebellion of the beings that were created for numerous purposes. And there was also the conflict that has been known as the conflict between the ancients and demons that you touched on earlier. People that wanted humanity to strive and become perhaps more independent, others that want to keep it under the thumb, and others that want to completely wipe it out. That's why you get those confusing messages in your Bible or the Quran, because they're copied of much older sources and they try to confine everything under one god when in reality those were numerous gods, and therefore you get so many apparent contradictions, because very often what you understand as God, or the devil for that matter, were different people simply that had a different opinions, but not necessarily a spiritual battle. Very often there was just a difference of opinion on what humanity should go through.
Okay. Do you know roughly what the population of Earth was around the time of this pole shift?
There were not very many after. There were approximately 100,000.
Okay. What race were they? I mean, were they Nordic or blue or black or many different races or what?
From what you're understanding now as Nordic is perhaps the closest to it, but it doesn't look exactly like, for example, the population of Sweden or Denmark today. But there are still some people on your planet left that at least look somewhat similar to those original creations that proceeded there. But that's the people that lived there, necessarily the gods, so to speak, that were living alongside them.
Okay. Were they about the same height as people are today, or were they like giants?
No, they were much taller. Well, depends what you would consider a giant. Not as tall as I am, but much taller than you.
Okay.
2 meters, for example, but rather a normal or at least an average size, or perhaps even a small size.
Okay.
Talking about the gods here, or those beings that have been considered such in the Antarctic and region, there were different beings that didn't look much like any people on your planet. However, they governed many people in your world. They also had a certain influence on the Asian, South American, and Northern African continents much later on.
So, just to clarify, you're saying the population of humans back during that time were much taller than people today? Or did you mean the gods?
First and foremost, the gods are much taller, but since they interpret with humans, it greatly depends on what your definition is. Many in your mythology have considered them half gods in the beginning, but you like to put all those spiritual labels on things, but ultimately they were simply genetic engineering, to put it very bluntly. I think your civilization is old enough now, not in terms of age, but frequency, to understand that. It was simply genetic engineering that created certain races or racial subgroups or genetic groups, whatever term you like to use. And then due to the Luciferian rebellion, again, whatever you want to call it, and there was sexual intercourse between what you consider mostly male gods, which again are simply visitors, with mostly females. There are rare occurrences of the opposite way around. Mostly it was the males and females from Earth that were newly created that had sexual intercourse, and then they simply had offspring, and which now were considered half gods thousands of years, in some cases tens of thousands of years later. So
Okay.
the sizes, of course, also varied depending how much blood of the gods, so to speak. So originally, the idea of divine rulership was also connected to a certain degree to physical attributes like height.
Okay.
There you also get the original hierarchy, since you were asking early on about the governmental structure. It was originally perhaps a theocracy, but not what you would consider a theocracy today, like the Vatican City or perhaps the nation of Iran. And it was more the idea it was literally ruled over by beings that were considered gods, and there was a hierarchy depending on how much extraterrestrial a person was, so to speak. But that was, of course, a hierarchy established by the people that were considered gods and that were placed at the top of that pyramid, so to speak.
Okay.
This is also a principle that was reinforced in Atlantis and other cultures that came from there, like ancient Egypt or Sumer, and even later cultures like Persia and even Greece before they had the idea of democracy in their much later stages.
I gotcha. So, is there a physical hole at the exact South Pole leading to the inner Earth?
There certainly is a hole, but it's not like it's simply an entry. Just drives through there with a boat, sails through there, and then you're suddenly in the inner Earth. You also have to enter perhaps another dimension if you wish. It's not a good way to put it, but it's the best way I can put it now in these words. But yes, there is something like an entry at the exact pole. At the exact pole, you can move in there. The theory of your so-called hollow Earth is not quite correct, but there's a lot to that, yes. There is civilization inside your Earth, and yes, that the polar regions, not just there, but there specifically, where you're asking, there are entries, yes, but there are numerous other cavern systems that lead down there at various points on your planet. But if you want, you consider it the main entry and exit gates, if you let me use the metaphor for your planet.
Okay. So today we have a research base and a 3 foot tall pole marking what's claimed to be the exact South Pole. Is this just a false cover to keep people away from the real South Pole?
The military is having a certain ring around the pole, so other researchers might be either included in that knowledge or they are simply kept in the dark. But you can be certain your current state of affairs, something is You always have an official story for everything, and if research is not done in the confinement of the military, then it's likely not a real research, unfortunately.
Okay, so the pole that is claimed to be at the exact South Pole. How far away is it from the real pole?
Perhaps 100 kilometers approximately, but I do not know exactly for certain which one of those stations you're referring to as claiming to be at the South Pole. Well, the South Pole is a wide variety, but when you're meaning the exact magnetic pole, it's a difficult term because magnetism works much different from what your scientists are aware of, especially on your planet, as the magnetism is mostly in the crust of the Earth and not necessarily at the pole.
Okay, what I'm saying is today we have a research base which is supposedly at the exact South Pole. Do you know how far away that is from the real South Pole?
Yes, as I shared, it's like the 100 kilometers, but again, depends greatly what you consider the real South Pole. But from what you're asking, I believe it is approximately 100 kilometers away.
Okay. When we were talking about like Hyperborea and the pole shift and everything, I had asked you what the population around the time of the pole shift was, and you said after the pole shift it was about 100,000. Do you know what the population was before the pole shift?
Well, from what I'm reading, there were at least a few million, but it greatly depends what was directly before, or if you're talking about people who had already fled underground, or those that were off world and still linked to the civilization.
Let's say like yeah, people that were living on the surface. Like basically, how many people died in the pole shift?
Well, directly or indirectly, likely about 10 million, but depends what timeline you're reading. Currently, what I'm asking, 5 million at least died directly.
Okay. And what do you mean? Like, what's the difference? What do you consider the difference between directly and indirectly?
Immediately from the pole shift and the weather, the climate changing, people living in conditions they could no longer sustain themselves, people engaging in warlike scenarios because of the aftermath of the pole shift. Those are
Oh,
those.
yeah, I see.